Hi, my name is Alex,
And I'm Sonia.
and we're going to tell you about the English Renaissance. First, for a history of the Italian Renaissance, there were many different art techniques, such as Classicism, which was a focus on Greek and Roman motifs, Individualism, which focuses on the self over the group, Secularism, which shifts the focus away from the church, Humanism, a focus on free will and the human body, Idealism, which focuses on perspectivism and painting the ideal versions of life. Realism, which focuses on realistic normal days and scenes. Materialism, a focus on material wealth and luxury. Skepticism, which focuses on knowledge and questions everything. Perspectivism, a focus on art using special techniques such as vanishing point, where a line is drawn to one point, creating depth. Atmospheric haze, which obscures and fogs up visibility to create depth, and chiaroscuro, which uses light and dark to create illusion, depth, and drama. For art, it focused on reviving Greco-Roman art and architecture, which we see in Classicism. It also uses religious themes to convey bigger or deeper messages, has an emphasis on the human form and naturality, hence the nakedness we see in, for example, the photo under art, and it was made to highlight individuals and their emotions and experiences. And then for literature, we have a spread in secular ideas about the church and society at large, new ideas about life and society, for example, in Dante's Inferno and Machiavelli. There's also a focus on self and character development throughout stories and questioning everything and pursuing knowledge and intelligence. Then, for a history of the English Renaissance, some key elements of the English Renaissance were plays, which are works meant to be played on a stage. This was majorly due to the influence of Queen Elizabeth I, which we'll get into in the next slide. English language, which played a large role in the printing press, Protestantism, an alternative form of Christianity, and is hated by traditionalists. This was a major point of contention during the Renaissance, as the division between the Catholics and Protestants led to lots of death and division in England. The 95 Theses, which were a series of grievances of the Church written by Martin Luther. This was a majorly influential document at the time. Drama, which included a lot of outer and inner turmoil causing conflict, and patronism, which is when many kings and queens would fund art. This was especially true for Elizabeth I. Then for some differences, there was a big focus on realism and skepticism in the Italian Renaissance, and then a focus on idealism and humanism in the English Renaissance, a focus on music and literature versus a focus on art and perspectivism, and a focus on religion, specifically Protestantism, and then a focus on Christianity, not Protestantism specifically, during the Italian versus the English Renaissance. And then for art, it used darker color palettes because of the colder climate. It didn't use perspectivism as much and focused more on humanism and individualism. And we had a focus on realism over idealism and more skeptical of the world around them. Then for literature, it focused on examining the church and its sins, using the printing press to translate and spread work, romanticism and true love, which we see in William Shakespeare, which we'll get a bit more into in the next slide, and recentering on the Greco-Roman principles and writing style, which shows classicism. Then for Queen Elizabeth specifically, she had a big effect on the English Renaissance as she was the ruler during the majority of it. Some important dates during Elizabeth I's rule were November 17th, 1558, which is when she takes the throne, 1576, which is when she builds the theater, a playhouse in London, August 8th, 1588, when she defeats the Spanish Armada, the 1580s, when England goes to America to attempt colony establishment. 1599 is when she builds the Global Theater, where Shakespeare would show many of his plays, and March 24th, 1603, when Queen Elizabeth dies. So the theater and the Global Theater in 1576 and 1599 are both great examples of patronism and how that affected the English Renaissance. Some important people in her life were Sir Francis Walsingham, a spy for the Queen, and assisted her in many of her issues. Robert Dudley, who was the Queen's lover. This spurred romanticism as many people wondered her relationship with him. Queen Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, was her sister and rival, and it spurred the Renaissance because of her persecution of Protestants. Walter Raleigh, an explorer of America and the Queen's personal friend. Philip II, the leader of the Spanish Armada who she defeated, and the ex-husband of her dead sister Mary. And then Queen Mary of Scots, who was Elizabeth's cousin and biggest rival and threat to her power, who was later executed by Queen Mary Elizabeth I in a very controversial death. Queen Elizabeth was extremely upset over her death, saying she'd signed the warrant but didn't want it to send it out yet. To this day, it's unknown whether or not she was genuinely upset or just pretending to seem innocent. Then for art, there is an emphasis on Elizabeth's extravagance and ornate dresses and jewelry, which we see in this picture under art, where she has these big frills and lots of jewels all over her dress as well as on her necklaces. It often shows religious symbols to solidify her place as the Virgin Queen and deifying herself. This shows the cult of Gloriana, which was a nickname she was given because she was such a religious figure at the time. And portraits chose to flatter her over all else instead of staying realistic, which shows a shift towards idealism during the English Renaissance. Finally, for literature, there was a large focus on romance. Take, for example, Shakespeare, the influence of Robert Dudley and Walter Riley, who was another man who she was alleged to have been, seeing during her reign. There was a more prevalent focus on poetry after the opening of the theater and the global theater, and her stability provided a breeding ground for new works, and dramas became more popular as she liked them a great deal and would oftentimes go and see William Shakespeare's plays in person, which we see in this image in the bottom right corner.
So now we'll look at an artist whose portraits contributed significantly to the English Renaissance, and his name was George Gower, who was an English portrait painter working as a surgeon painter for Queen Elizabeth I in 1581. And at first, George Gower started with portraits of himself. An example is on the left. And then he transitioned to painting numerous portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, contributing significantly to the development of royal portraiture, specifically of Queen Elizabeth. Gower's artwork reflects the Renaissance through his use of realism, symbolism, and classicism, or praising of royal status. Additionally, he focused largely on materialism and wealth in his paintings. George Gower didn't just focus on the Queen in his paintings, but he also focused on other individuals, but he still painted a lot of royal people and people with high social status. And here are four of his paintings. On the left is Elizabeth Nolly, who he painted in 1549, and she's the first cousin to Queen Elizabeth, and she served as the Queen's maid of honor and as a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber. And then is Charles Somerset, who was a son of an aristocrat, Henry Beaufort. And then is a portrait of Lettice Knollys, and she was the Queen's cousin and she served in court. And lastly is a portrait of Thomas Kiteson in 1573, who played a crucial role in establishing the Church of England during the English Renaissance. And in each of these paintings, you see the common themes of realism, materialism, individualism, and classicism. But of course, what largely made George Gower well known were his paintings of the Queen, specifically the Armada portrait painted in 1588, and he portrayed realism, humanism, individualism, materialism, classicism, and idealism as he demonstrates an ideal image of the Queen, and he used techniques like atmospheric haze and chiaroscuro. And this painting heavily influenced the Renaissance by presenting the Queen as a strong monarch and shaping how the public viewed the English monarchy. Thank you for
Thanks
listening.
for listening.